I'm sure you don't need me to tell you just how many RPGs there are that feature a silent protagonist as the main character. Most of the time, it's used to allow the player to have an avatar for immersing themselves into the world with, or to allow it to be, in a way, their own adventure. Now, while I think this style of character has a place in games, I can't help but wish we had more silent protagonists whose silence was diegetic and actually meant anything at all to the story. And to be honest, I can only name 2 characters who do exactly that. Otis from Owlboy, which is the footage you're currently watching, and a character from a very unique action RPG called Crosscode. Made by Radical Fish, Crosscode was successfully crowdfunded on Indiegogo and released in 2018 to praise from fans and critics alike. I actually first heard about the game from my dad, who was really interested in playing it himself, so when the game was finally released on the Switch, I decided to try it out for myself. And without going too deep into my thoughts on it for right now, Crosscode was a really great time. The game's combat and overall presentation was really well done, and I loved how they combined traits of an action RPG with some elements you might see in a Zelda game to make some really cool and creative dungeons. Then there's our quiet lady of the hour, Lee, but I'll save the praise for her character for later, because I got a lot to say about her. Time to take a deep dive into the world of Crosscode. Let's get started. Crosscode takes place in the online MMORPG Crossworlds, where our main character Lee wakes up aboard a ship called the MS Solar and is currently missing her memory. In order to get it back, she gets help from a man named Sergey who's here to serve as her guide while she plays Crossworlds to try and get her memories back. Unfortunately for her though, there seems to be a problem with her speech module and can only say certain words that are hard-coded into her avatar, courtesy of Sergey. And to be honest, I think that's about all I can talk about in regards to the story without getting into spoilers. Crosscode's plot is a bit of a slow burn, so a lot of the game just involves Lee traveling around the world of Shadoon with fellow player and new friend, Emily. So with that being said, I'd like to take the time to get into the actual world itself, because it is far more unique than what I was initially expecting. Okay, so how do I explain this without turning into a lore dump? Okay, so to the people watching this who have never seen this game before, or don't know much about it, if you had to guess what kind of game Crossworlds is in universe, would you say it's virtual reality or augmented reality? Come to your answer? Well, I hope you didn't think too hard about it, because technically both options are actually half right. Set likely thousands of years in the future, Crosscode takes place in a world where humanity's colonized the galaxy and technology is so advanced that companies like Entertainment, the company that made Crossworlds, can just casually terraform a moon to serve as the setting for their video game. Yes, the entirety of the game takes place on a terraformed moon orbiting a gas planet that, through the use of something known as instant matter, an incredibly light, incredibly fragile substance that both the avatars and environments are made of, they can have people from all over the galaxy come to the world of Shadoon using a cross-gear headset, a device that, from what I can tell, effectively puts the player's minds physically into their avatar so they can experience the world the same way they would in normal life. There is a good amount of lore you can find that develops the universe further, but real talk, this is probably one of the most creative takes on a story like this that I think I've ever seen. It's not just some virtual world, it's an actual place you, or well, more accurately, someone in this universe, could go to that's been physically built to be an actual game world through insanely advanced technology. Mad respect to the guys at Radical Fish. This is genuinely one of the coolest takes on the idea of physically going into a game world that I've ever seen. Okay, so normally I wouldn't be making a section dedicated to a game's overall presentation, primarily because I don't usually have enough to say to justify it, but for once, I can actually make more than a passing comment or two on how a game looks and sounds. Okay, so to start off, let's discuss the game's art style, because Crosscode's pixel art is absolutely gorgeous. All of the game's environments and dungeons look great, with Sapphire Ridge being my favorite area in the game. Though, if I'm being honest, my bias for the color blue might be a big reason why it's my favorite. Special attention absolutely needs to be drawn to the game's character portraits, though. More specifically, Lee's. All of them look good across the board, but with Lee being a mostly silent protagonist, a lot of attention was given to her portraits, specifically to better portray her character. Honestly, you can take one look at these and immediately get an idea of how she's feeling, and in some cases, even what she's thinking. My favorite easily has to be this one. I bust the biggest gut laughing when I first saw this because I was in no way expecting Lee to have a face that radiates this much smugness. Like, every time I look at it, I can only imagine Lee thinking, "God, I'm amazing." That being said though, for as much as I love the game's visuals, they do create an issue with depth perception. You see, when exploring, it was sometimes hard to tell where a path was or how high up I was when jumping from one platform to another. One issue is that sometimes things just blend in with the environment or are hidden a little too well. For example, in the game's last dungeon I was trying to solve this puzzle here involving me hitting the shock orb enough to get a shield effect. I tried getting Lee's balls to ricochet off of this fence here, but with how it's built, I couldn't get it to go upwards, and was left confused for about 5 or 6 minutes on what I was missing. As it turns out, what I wasn't seeing was this spot up here, because I didn't realize it wasn't part of the fence. The good part though is that this specific issue, while annoying, isn't exactly frequent. I can't say this about the platforming though. I've had a few times where I tried to hop from one place to another, only to realize I was on a lower level than it. As a bit of a tip, you can actually judge how high up you are based on the shadow of the angle cursor. Similarly, if you're not sure if a platform is higher, just toss a few balls to see if it bounces off or not. Thankfully, neither of these issues are too big a deal, and in the case with the former, it's pretty infrequent anyway. The music, though, I have zero issues with. This entire soundtrack is wonderful. I don't think there's a single piece of music in the game I don't at the very least like. Some of my favorite songs in the game are Awakening, for how peaceful it is, pretty much every battle theme in the game, especially the main boss battle theme, and the song Sadness for very spoilery reasons. Honestly, even if this video doesn't convince you to pick this game up, you owe it to yourself to give the soundtrack a listen, cause I can't emphasize enough how good it is. Frankly, I think I found a few new songs to add to my editing playlist. Gameplay in Crosscode is divided into 2 different sections, exploring and questing through Crossworlds with Lee and friends, as well as taking on the game's various dungeons. Starting with the former, I'd like to first say that I have no issues with Crosscode's combat. Honestly, I'd go as far as to say it's as close to perfect as you could get. As a whole, combat just feels really good, and every attack has a nice and satisfying punch to it. When fighting enemies, Lee has a large variety of combat options at her disposal that only gets bigger as the game goes on. Starting out, you have access to your usual melee attack and dash, but you also have a guard you can use as well as Lee's balls, and for my own safety, I need to start referring to them as spheres, because Lee's starting to give me a JoJo reference-sized death glare, and I might not make it to the end of this video if I don't change how I word it. Lee's spheres have a lot of use in puzzle solving, but combat-wise they're very useful at killing enemies from a distance, and in the case an enemy is defending a part of their body, you can ricochet a charge shot off of the walls to hit them from behind. As you go through the game, you'll also unlock the elemental circuits, new attack modes that get added to Lee's circuit board when she goes through a new temple. Each one has its own stat buffs and special attacks separate from Lee's neutral board, and using the SP you get from leveling up, they can be upgraded. Because of how varied the special attacks and different stat buffs are for each element, they're all very useful in combat for different reasons. Heat and shock can inflict a damage over time status effects, making them great for dealing extra damage when fighting an enemy that isn't resistant to them, or is even weak to them. Combat in Crosscodes does a great job at giving the player a lot of options and techniques to use for any number of different playstyles. Because every part of Lee's arsenal will also have multiple different specials she can use, it lets the player build exactly how they want to play the game. If you want to go defensive with how you play, your guard and dash arts will do a great job at letting you do that. Or if you want, you can be like me and play hyper-aggressive the entire game and rarely ever touch your dash and guard arts, and the game is more than okay with you doing that. Something I'm ashamed to admit I didn't know about until very, very late in the game, is that some of the wave elements specials can actually heal you based on how much damage the attack does, making it very useful for when you need a quick heal, because let me tell ya, this game is the exact opposite of easy. Crosscode can be more than a little brutal with its difficulty at points, but I never found it to be unfair at all. Every fight felt perfectly learnable and fair, but if the difficulty feels a little too high for you, don't worry, because the game's assist mode has you covered. The game is intended to provide a more challenging experience, but if you like, you can go to the options menu and you can adjust things like how much damage you receive, as well as the frequency of enemy attacks, and even the puzzle speed. As a side note, when outside dungeons or mini-dungeons, you can also invite a few characters to form a party with to make things a little bit easier on yourself. And because this game in-universe is an MMO, you don't need to worry about getting them new equipment or their levels, since they deal with all that on their own time. It doesn't matter much which characters you bring mechanically since there's no real strategy to it, so you can bring pretty much whoever you want. I always just went with Emily and another character you meet later, Citron, since I love Emily's friendship with Lee and find them to be absolutely adorable together, and Citron is just nice to have around. You also don't need to worry about healing them, since they bring their own healing items, which is great, because any sort of item above the stuff you can buy at the general stores requires trading to make them, like the chef sandwiches. You can get items to trade for new ones from breaking things in the environment, but if you're wanting materials for equipment, you'll also need to farm for materials off of monsters too, and helping you with this is the game's ranking system. As you defeat enemies in the field, you'll slowly start to build up a bonus rank. The higher the rank, the higher your chances of getting rarer drops, and in some cases you can only get certain drops at higher ranks. There's a pretty big number of powerful equipment you can farm materials for, but I myself never felt the need to do it, partly because I was worried I would get overpowered. You can also get items from side quests, and I gotta say, the side quests are so good in this game. Like, I think a lot of RPGs could stand to take a few notes from Crosscode when it comes to this. I mean, sure, you have your usual, hey, can you get X thing for me quests? But there aren't many of those, and some of them lead into really interesting ones. Like this chain right here, where Lee helps the Godfather smuggle much-needed medication into base and keep by finding a new smuggling route for them. Heck, some of them will even lead you to mini-dungeons complete with its own full-on boss fight. Some of my favorite quest lines are the quest line where you help this one older player find broken weapons for a secret event, all of these ending in a cool boss fight. There's also this other one, where Lee's hired to defuse a hostage situation involving minigun-wielding mafia birds, but unfortunately, due to her speech issues, she's forced to settle it with violence, much to her dismay. I also love the collection of secret facility quests, partly for their funny video game references, but also for the really cool boss fights, with my favorite being the Hedgelord. Also, when I was fighting Mecha Gear Fish, yes, that is his name, I had this happen. In the footage you're currently seeing, I can promise you I'm not pressing any buttons. I broke down his defenses, attacked him once, and I just started dying on me. To be completely honest with you, I have no idea what I did. On the subject of bosses though, once you've fully unlocked Rhombus Square, you can get access to the arena where you can partake in any one of the arena cups, a series of enemy battles and boss refights to test your skills and earn arena medals to get access to some really good equipment and cosmetic items. As a note to any completionists watching this video, every match has a secret platinum medal you can earn aside from the normal bronze to gold, but you don't get anything for it except for bragging rights, which conveniently is also why I don't have any footage of me getting a platinum medal. So far, I've said nothing but praise for Crosscode's gameplay, and I've got a lot of great things to say about its dungeons, since some of the game's strongest points are in them, but ironically in some ways, I do think it's the weakest part of the gameplay. Let me start this chapter of the video off by saying just how much I love the dungeons in Crosscode. They combine the Zelda series' more puzzly elements with the base mechanics of the game to create something very unique. Each dungeon will have one or two mechanics that will be used in all of its puzzles, and even the boss fight at the end. And they not only combine that with the dungeon's element, but also any elements you would have at this point, making each element mechanically useful through the entire thing. This is where I need to give praise to Lee's spheres, as they're one of the best aspects of puzzle solving in the game. Their ability to ricochet off of walls combined with the different properties they take on with Lee's different elements makes them a very simple but very effective tool for puzzles. Of all the dungeons in the base game, I think my favorite has to go to either Berdom Mine or the Fire Temple. The Berdom Mine makes a great first impression for the game's larger dungeons, with its cool bomb puzzles and its really awesome boss with a giant mining robot. The Fire Temple is the introduction to these lanterns that shoot off your elemental shots, and it uses them in some really nice ways, and I think its boss, this giant fire moth here, is pretty cool with its use of the dungeon's main mechanic. That being said though, while I think all of the game's puzzles are good and fun to solve, after a certain point they start getting a little exhausting. There came a time in the game where I would start looking at one of those bullet puzzles where you had to ricochet off of all the bumpers in a room, and I would only be able to think to myself, oh great, another one of these. Joy. By the last half of the game, some puzzles can get kinda long, and with the example I mentioned previously, some of these get pretty hard and leave you next to no wiggle room for errors unless you adjust the game's puzzle speed in its assist mode, meaning there very well may be points where you spend 10 to 15 minutes, sometimes longer, on just one puzzle. I am willing to give the game a little slack for this though, because it's possible I only have as much of a problem with it as I do because of my working schedule. For context, I usually record in 3 sessions every day, with each session being about 2 hours at least and 2.5 hours at most. So usually I'm spending around 6 hours a day playing. This became an issue when I got to Chapter 8 and I found out that I would have to do 3 full-size dungeons nearly back-to-back from one another. And with each dungeon taking me around 2 to 2.5 hours, that's about 6 to 7 hours worth of puzzle-filled dungeons, all recorded in one day. Like, in a vacuum, all of these dungeons are good, but doing all 3 of them so close together is not only tiring because you'll be dealing with similar puzzles for about 6-ish hours, but it also just breaks up the game's pacing in a weird way with how long the gameplay sections of Chapter 8 are. It's possible that if I played the game more casually, I wouldn't be as exhausted with puzzle solving, but even still, I feel like if they were to do a Crosscode 2, they could stand to go a little easier on the puzzles. They're great, but it gets a little much after a while. That being said though, it's finally time for the spoiler section of the video, so skip to here or click the link to the last chapter in the description below if you want to avoid that. Because I got a lot of nice things to say about our main heroine Lee here, and, well, pretty much all of those things are spoiler related. Crosscode's story is made as good as it is thanks to its characters and writing, especially with its main heroine, Lee. Lee is probably the best silent protagonist I've ever seen in a game. She, without ever uttering a singular sentence, manages to be a great and compelling character that left a pretty big impression on me. Due to Lee's inability to properly speak, she has a lot of trouble communicating with people. Making this worse is that due to her being a prototype evotar, basically an AI clone of another player based on their avatar, she has an issue remembering abstract concepts like sign language and how to write, meaning unlike most mute people, Lee has no actually good way of saying how she feels. This makes for some very interesting moments in the game for her after the events of Chapter 7. It's here she learns the truth about herself after being forcibly taken to the Vermilion Wastes, and after escaping, she finds herself incapable of talking to her friends about what happened after having been gone a week, or even apologizing for making them worry. And this is where I need to give more praise to Lee's expressiveness. The developers do an excellent job at telling you how Lee feels based on her facial expressions and what limited vocabulary she has, and the moment she finds out the truth about herself and the following aftermath is the perfect example of this. After getting a tour of Vermilion Wastes from Lucas, she turns in for the night since they have no quest for the day, only to then be met by Shizuka, the sister of the man who created Lee, Satoshi, and the very person Lee's based on. After being very aggressively told the truth, she finds out that Sergei has been lying to her about being human the entire time, and that she has no real life outside the game, and the abject horror in her face as she just sits there in her room Zen garden just hits really hard. She's in disbelief about what she is, she's angry about being lied to, and more than anything, she's scared about the fact that she's unable to leave Crossworlds, and they communicate all of this with her facial expressions and few words she's capable of saying. The following section is one of the most memorable moments in the entire game for me. Throughout the entire day, there's no music whatsoever, only the sounds of the environment and combat. The once creepy and off-putting Vermilion Wastes now has this feeling of emptiness. There's nothing to be felt in the current situation. Like, for a brief period of time, Lee's crisis mentally takes her out of the situation completely, unable to truly focus on anything else. Which makes it all the more impactful when sadness starts playing as Lucas begins to console her, and having such a beautifully sad-sounding song play after so long without music shows for me that at this moment, Lee's finally fully processed the situation and is ready to start letting it out however she can. The moments in Chapter 8 where she wants to tell Emily what happened are really good too. Lee's incapable of saying anything, so she instead avoids Emily since she's mad at her, and it all wraps up with Citron tricking the two into meeting up so they can apologize in this incredibly sweet, tearful hug. I can't properly communicate just how much praise I have for how well they handled Lee's character and her relationships with the main cast. Crosscode does a masterful job of showing how someone feels rather than just straight up telling you how they feel. That being said though, I think the game has a bit of a problem with pacing. It takes until Chapter 7 for the story to really start moving forward with the plot, since up to this point, it's just been Lee's adventures with Emily and Sergei, and despite the fact that it's Chapter 7 of 10, it weirdly feels more like the halfway point of the game with how long Chapter 8 is, and given that about 70% of it is gameplay, not much really happens aside from Lee mending her relationship with Emily in the, at least, 8 or 9 hours you'll be spending on this one chapter alone. Also, for as interesting as what Sidwell was as a villain, I can't help but feel like we should have gotten more time with him, since we don't know much about him as a person, and I find it difficult to get a good read on the guy. On one hand, he actively tortured other Evotars to get information off of them to sell to the black market, but on the other, he seemed to have a genuinely good friendship with Lee prior to her memory loss. It doesn't seem like there was any ulterior motives there. Honestly, I liked Gotham as a villain more because he got more development as a character, and I felt genuinely bad that this humble game designer got forced into something so morally wrong. And honestly, it caught me way off guard when he walked out of his workroom after the final battle to straight up commit suicide over the guilt of his actions. And it was heartbreaking seeing Lee be physically incapable of stopping him. There's a lot that I love about Crosscode's story, but I can't help but wish that we got something, like an epilogue, to expand on the fate of the Evotars after beating Sidwell, and more on what happened to Sidwell himself. Oh, wait a minute! Released 3 years after the base game, A New Home is a DLC epilogue to the game's main story that, as alluded to before, expands on the fate of the Evotars and gives a little bit more context to Sidwell's possible fate, but sadly not his character. Taking place 7 months after the events of the main story, Lee comes to in the New Village homestead, complete with a new home for her and all the other Evotars since Instatainment has approved of further research into them. After a sweet reunion with the others and finishing up Chapter 6's raid from before, which was super cool by the way, loved that boss fight, it's also revealed that not only was Citron spying on her in the base game, he also, for reasons unknown, had an Evotar made of him. So the main story for the DLC is how exactly Citron was connected to Sidwell and finding out what he knows about him so they can track him down, as well as the fact that Crossworlds is getting its final dungeon soon. In terms of new gameplay additions, we have technically 3 new areas, the new Ascended equipment, which scales in level to Lee, and a whole new dungeon. Talking about the new areas, we have Lee's new village homestead, which is a nice little area to explore for some items, and it's great that Lee actually has a lovely little home to stay in. Azure Archipelago is a nice little beach area you can explore off the coast of Rhombus Square. Visually, it's very pretty, and it has some cool enemies you can fight, but at first I was a little upset we didn't get a cool little beach dungeon. Keyword here being at first, because the game's new dungeon, Culero Temple, easily makes up for that. Culero Temple is Crossworld's last dungeon, and the technical third area of the expansion, since the inside of it is so big it actually has outside areas complete with its own breakable objects for materials. And Culero Temple is easily the best dungeon in the game for me, no contest. Aside from the fact that it's my favorite dungeon visually, it has a really cool main mechanic and this weird blobby space rock that you'll have to learn the physics for since it interacts with each of your elements in different ways. Fire launches it forward, ice also pushes it forward but makes it quickly fall down like a brick, shock pulls it towards you, and wave ricochets a beam off of walls to teleport the space rock. Throughout the dungeon, you'll have to use the rock's physics to solve puzzles and break these weird barriers and rooms, and you'll even use them for the bosses too. I wish the last half of the game's dungeons had more unique things like this instead of just another bullet puzzle, because honestly, even the bullet puzzles for this dungeon are made more interesting thanks to the inclusion of the space rock. What is easily the most important thing this entire DLC added though, is the fact that Lee now has a way of communicating with Sergei's new invention, the Lee board, meaning she and Emily will now be able to chat as much as they want, which is just awesome. Crosscode was a really great, unique experience for me. It had absolutely fantastic combat that has plenty of depth to it, and has a level of challenge that makes for some very satisfying fights. The side quests are some of the best I've ever seen, with some pretty funny dialogue and a surprising level of diversity with the kind of things you'll be doing. The game also has some really great mind-bending puzzles that help make for some very unique dungeons, since I don't know if I've ever seen an action RPG ever lean so heavily on puzzle solving before. And I can't stress enough how much I love the game's writing and characters, cause Lee is probably the best silent protagonist I've ever seen. The game can easily take you over 60 hours if you're going for everything, and for 20 bucks, this game's frankly a steal. And if you like the game, maybe consider getting its DLC epilogue when you're done. It's 10 bucks and adds a nice amount of extra content. I'm very much looking forward to Radical Fish's next game, Project Terra, since they aim to improve on Crosscode's style of gameplay further. And from the prototype videos they've shown, it's looking really good so far, and seems to have fixed the depth perception issue present with Crosscode, so that's already one issue ironed out. Anyways though, that's gonna be all for me today. Next time you come back, it'll be my review on Xenoblade Chronicles 3. Thank you all for watching, and I hope you have a nice day.